Now, before I get to the text, this morning's text, just a word about what we're talking about. It seems like over the past year, the whole entire staff has been having a love affair with Moses. We've preached a lot and talked a lot about Moses and about the book of Exodus. And so today I am going to preach out of Exodus chapter 3. And for those of you who don't know the very beginning of the story, most people know the story about Moses, that he parted the Red Sea, or that he was, taken up out of the Nile River when he was an infant, but I don't think a lot of people know actually how he got there. And so just a brief word about how Moses came to be. Moses was born in Egypt to Hebrew parents. And at the time he was born, the Pharaoh who was ruling over Egypt decided that there were far too many Jewish people living in Egypt, and they were a cause of alarm for him. So he told the midwives in Egypt that every male child born to a Hebrew woman was to be killed. And that's exactly what happened, and there's history that shows that happened. However, Moses' mother decided that she was going to attempt to rescue her son's life. So before he was born, she made a basket out of reeds. After the baby was born, she placed him in that basket and floated him down the Nile in hopes that somebody would rescue him. In fact, Pharaoh's daughter rescued him out of the Nile River, and he was raised in Pharaoh's palace. After he became an adult, he was wandering around town, so the story goes, and saw an Egyptian master beating a Hebrew slave. Moses went to rescue that slave, and in the process of that, killed the Egyptian master. Fearing for his own life, he ran. He found himself in Midian, where he met Jethro's daughters. Jethro was a shepherd in Midian, and he married one of Jethro's daughters and became the shepherd for Jethro's flocks. One day, as he was caring for those flocks, he went up Mount Horeb and found himself face to face with a bush that was on fire but not consumed. And out of that bush came the voice of God calling his name. God told Moses that there was a new job for him, and that is where we're going to pick up the story in verse 13 of chapter 3. But Moses said to God, "If I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." He said further, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'I am has sent me to you.'" God also said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations.'" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So if you wondered if names mean anything, I hope that this text will help you figure out that the answer is yes. Names do mean something. They have some significance. Ask anybody who has family that came to this country through Ellis Island, and if their names were changed for whatever reason, whether someone at Ellis Island couldn't pronounce it or spell it correctly or decided it wasn't a good name, they can tell you what their original name, their original family name was, and what it meant to their family, and how that change came about. And if that doesn't convince you that names mean something, then consider this. When someone says your name wrong, what is the first thing you do? You correct the pronunciation of your name. Many times at our house, when we get a sales call, people will be looking for the Peckmans. Now, what I would love to say is, "I'm sorry, they don't live here." But instead, what they usually hear is, "I'm sorry, that would be Peckham." And then I tell them that I'm not interested in whatever they're selling. But our name means something. About a year and a half ago, the women's Bible study on their very first meeting told each other the story of how we received our first names. And it was really interesting to hear those stories, because what we found out is that we didn't just get our first names randomly, but that many of us in the room received a name that had some significance to our family. So you could go way back into the generations and find that name over and over again. Our names had significance to our family, and they tied our present with our past so that we didn't forget where we came from through the power of our names. Now, the Bible does the same exact thing over and over again. Names have significance in the scripture. Abraham and Sarah, the mother and father of the faith, were originally Abram and Sarai. And their name was changed by God as they traveled from the land that they knew and grew up in to the land that was yet unnamed but claimed by God. God gave them the covenant, and God changed their name. And then there is Jacob, the leader of the Hebrew people. His name was changed to Israel. He was not only the one who led the Hebrew people through the promised land, but he was also the one who represented God in that land. And then, of course, in our story today, Moses. Moses literally means to draw out. And in this case, Moses means I drew him out of the water, as was his lineage. He was drawn out of the water of the Nile. So names mean something. They have power, they have significance. They tie us back to the past, but yet have significance for us even in this present day. So you could well imagine that when Moses comes upon this bush that is burning in the middle of the mountains somewhere, that there is some fear as he hears his name being called from that bush. And I don't know how many of you have had that experience, and if you have, I hope that you will share it with me, because I would love to hear your story about the burning bush. So would probably a few other people, like your doctor. But in the meantime, Moses hears this voice, Moses, Moses, and of course he's afraid, but he's also curious. And he's curious enough to stay and engage in a conversation with that burning bush, who he comes to understand to be the presence of God. God is speaking to Moses. Moses, the one who was taken out of the Nile River. Moses, the one who murdered somebody. Moses, the one who ran away from the consequences of his actions. Here is God speaking to this man and telling him, I have a job for you. And like so many of the prophets that would come after him, except for Isaiah, Moses gives a resounding answer of, no way. I am not going. I don't want this job. But God is persistent. And in the midst of that conversation, Moses hears who this God is. I have heard the cry of my people. I have seen the cruelty of the Egyptians. I have called you by name to go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh that it is time to let my people go. And I will be with you. Now, we know from the story that Moses wants none of this. He does not want to go back to Egypt for a really good reason. The truth is that if Moses just goes back to Egypt, he can be killed. And so his excuses actually make sense. I mean, who wants to go, even if God is going with them, into a place where really your life hangs in the balance, where you could die just from going back there? And so in the midst of this conversation, God gives Moses some assurances. And perhaps those are the things that God is really trying to convince Moses of. You're not going to be alone. You're not going to be alone. But then Moses asks that million-dollar question. Well, now I'm going to totally rewrite the script here. Well, so okay, God. So you have just said to me that I get to go back to Egypt and you're going to be with me. And who exactly do I say sent me. And God says, you tell those people, I am sent you. Really, I am sent me. Who is I am? And what kind of name is that? You see, what Moses really wanted was a birth certificate, a driver's license, and a passport. He wanted to make sure that he could describe who sent him by name so that everybody would understand clearly who it was who was sending him. He didn't want to go back and look like a fool. He wanted a name. And God gave him a name. And it was a name that Moses couldn't possibly understand, and it's a name that none of us can really understand. I am who I am. Tell them I am sent you. What God was really trying to tell Moses is this: you are not going to put me in a nice little box where you can control me. I don't meet any of the standards of the world you live in. There is no culture that's going to define me. I have significance simply because I am. And I am all that you need to go back to Egypt. I can't imagine what was going on in Moses' head in those moments, but I can tell you just from my own understanding of what that moment must have felt like, the overwhelming fear and yet the overwhelming privilege of serving God in that way drove Moses to finally just go. But of course he went when God finally did meet some of his demands, right? When God finally said to Moses, okay, I'll send your brother Aaron with you so that you're not physically alone. That will be your assurance that I go with you. You see, I am is also willing to meet us exactly where we need to be met. So God gives Moses what God thinks Moses really wants, even though God knows that Moses doesn't need Aaron. And if you read the whole story, you'll find out that Aaron is mostly silent through the entire story of the release of bondage of the captives in Israel. So there you are. God gives Moses what Moses wants. Go tell them, I am sent you. I am all that you need. I am not in your control. I am the person who created time and space. I am the only one who controls time and space. I am bigger than your box. I am all that you need. I am your father. I am your sustainer. I am your redeemer. I am all in all. I am. Now, there's something really wonderful for me about the mystery of that name, and I'm sure that for Moses, at some point, he had to wonder what was so unique about that name, that it was a name like no other name. I mean, after all, what does it mean, I am? And how do you go and describe I am to a people who have been in bondage, a people who don't know what it's like to be free? I am the one who will free you from your bondage. I am the one who forgives your sin. I am the one who loves you with a sacrificial and everlasting love. You see, in the name I am, I believe there is real possibilities for life. Because I am meets us in any of our needs. I am is really defined not by what we can say and do, but by what the I am who is over us can say and do in us and through us. You see, Moses was just a regular guy. He was a regular human being who had this encounter that stopped him in his tracks. And the I am that he met along the way sent him in a new direction. And he became part of a story that he could never have written for himself. And I believe that as he continued to be in relationship, the power and the privilege and the love that he experienced unfolded the possibilities for life through the name I am. The same way that the possibilities and the life of I am unfolds before our eyes every single day, whether we recognize it or not. A number of years ago, I was in Israel, and the group that I was with had the privilege of spending an afternoon with a group of women who were all bound by the common life experience of being widows. They had come together, lived together under one roof, ate together, worked together. Part of how they took care of each other and of themselves and to pay for their living expenses was they were artisans, they were craftspeople. They made beautiful pieces of artwork. I have a stole that I bought while I was there that one of them had made, and it's lovely. While we were there, we heard their stories. We shared their grief and their pain. What was most amazing about this group of women, however, was not that they were all widows living together, but that they represented the three faiths that were predominant in Israel. They were Christian and Jewish and Muslim women, all living together under one roof, sharing this common bond of grief, all of them having lost their husbands in violent acts in their own communities. And somehow, in the midst of those stories, we began to see the power of I am at work as they shared the experience of going into schools and synagogues and temples and churches and talking about what peace in their community would really look like. A number of months ago, I got a call from a gentleman who I've known for a lot of years who had been estranged from his son, more years than he could count. They had had a business deal that had gone bad, and the father blamed the son, and the son blamed the father. When the son got married, he did not invite his father to his wedding. I can't imagine what life like that must be like, to be so estranged from your own children that they don't invite you to your wedding. And then one day, they found themselves at a funeral for a mutual friend. And while they were there at the funeral, at the end of the service, the woman whose husband was being buried said to the young man, "Is it not time for you to talk to your father?" As they were leaving in the parking lot, the two of them exchanged some words, not words of anger, but just some words. How are you? Are you well? How is your wife? A few weeks later, there was a phone call, and that young man called his son and said, "Dad, I think it's time for you to meet your grandchildren." I can't imagine how ugly that relationship must have been, that this young man would have denied his dad his grandchildren. And somehow, that great I am unfolded before their eyes in the power of the forgiveness and in the joy of a renewed and restored relationship. Just this week, on Wednesday, I learned that someone who I consider a friend, who I've known for a long time, who I've seen in the past few months, though she doesn't live nearby, I found out that in the first week of December, she attempted to commit suicide. Her life was idealistic. I mean, we all wanted to be so filled with the joy that she carried with her. We all wanted to have the kind of relationship that she had with her husband. We all thought her life was perfect. And then she took a bottle of antidepressants. And she didn't tell anybody. So this week, she decided that it was time to talk about that. To tell people what her experience was, that life isn't always what it seems like, and that even the most joy-filled people, the people that have the seemingly most perfect lives, are filled with a pain that cannot be touched. And nobody necessarily knows. And somehow this week, on Wednesday, I saw the power of I Am to heal the brokenhearted and to set the captive free. Her greatest shame has become her greatest source of ministry and healing for those people who need a word of hope. That's the power of the name, I Am. I am with you, no matter where you go, no matter what you experience, no matter where you find yourself. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever heard the voice of God calling you the way Moses did. I haven't. I haven't. But yet, I believe that we all are called, are mere human beings who have nothing necessarily extraordinary in our lives, but God calls each and every one of us to do the things that God would have us to do, whatever they are, and I can't name those things for you. But this is what I know, that God calls us, human beings, to do extraordinary things in the name of God. This is the God that Jesus knows. This is the God that Jesus represented to us. This is the God for whom Jesus says, I am. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Jesus says, I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. I am all you need to do extraordinary things, to bring a word of hope to the hopeless, to offer life to people who are the walking dead, to do things that you couldn't even imagine because your box is just not big enough. I am who I am is the one who calls each one of us. Perhaps not out of a bush, but perhaps in a way that we couldn't even begin to imagine. The word of a friend, an action that breaks our heart. It is I Am who calls us, and his name is love.